This week's science lesson is about the water cycle. Okay, let's recap what we did last lesson, which is really important because we'll need that information for what we're going to be doing today. So, what is evaporation? I don't want a simple answer. I want you to talk about states of matter and particles. Have a think. It's a changing of the state of the matter from a liquid to a gas. So going from a liquid where you have weak bonds that move freely and slide all over each other to particles with lots of energy, even weaker bonds, and they move randomly and rapidly and go around and around. Okay, what is condensation? Same thing. Can you talk about states of matter and particles? It's the changing of state of matter from a gas to a liquid. So it's the opposite to evaporation. So particles have lots of energy as a gas with weak bonds and they're moving around and around and around. And it's going back to having weak bonds that move and particles that move freely over each other. So, our learning objective is to identify the part played by evaporation and condensation, which it was I mentioned was quite important for today's lesson in the water cycle. So, everyone on Earth is dependent on water, but as we know, water doesn't stay in the same place forever, and it flows continuously around the world in a continuous process called the water cycle. Now, key vocabulary that we need is water cycle, obviously, the movement of water around the world in a continuous cycle. Precipitation is anything wet that falls from the sky. So it could be rain, my favourite snow, or hail. And you could have transpiration, which is the evaporation of water from the surface of leaves. And then surface runoff is the movement of the water that happens when rain or snow flows over the Earth's surface. And then the groundwater is water that's stored under and moves in the ground. Okay, as we mentioned, water flows around the world in a continuous cycle. And here's an example here where you've got arrows showing the circle of it going round. Now, I keep talking about it being a cycle. So if we know a cycle is as like a circle where there's no beginning or no end. So although there is no beginning or end, I'm going to start with ocean. So what process do you think happens to the surface layer of the ocean water? It's heated by the sun and it evaporates into water vapor. Now, remember, you don't have to have a water boiling at 100 degrees Celsius for it to evaporate. That turns into steam. This evaporates into water vapor, which is less than 100 degrees Celsius. So, if you've got maybe a forest, it's just finished raining and then the sun comes out. Then transpiration happens. Now remember, transpiration is when the water evaporates from the surface of the leaves. So the water vapor is created, traveling high into the atmosphere, forming clouds. Talking of clouds, who can remember what process happens to form a cloud? Condensation. That's what happens. That's when the water vapor, the gas, um, cools down and changes its state to become a liquid and it helps form the clouds. Now, what happens is the clouds get more and more water, they get bigger and bigger until they can't hold any onto it any longer and they have to release it. And water falls to the ground as either as rain, hail, or I might have mentioned before, my favourite, snow. And this is precipitation. So these three are anything wet that falls to the ground from the clouds. Surface runoff. Water can fall into rivers and lakes or oceans, but it can also fall onto the ground. And then when it falls onto the ground, it makes its way towards rivers and streams, which then make their way back to the oceans. When water flows across the surface of land, it's called surface runoff. Groundwater. Water can actually soak down into the ground. I know that when I did some gardening last year, I was pouring some water over some new seedlings, and the water went right down into the ground. And it can be stored and underground in rocks, and that store is called groundwater. But that groundwater also flows towards the oceans, and you can start seeing where the cycle starts coming round. Water from the rivers, the groundwater, and the surface runoff, they all join together and flow in the direction of the oceans, and that's where the cycle starts again. Here is the example of the water cycle diagram we saw earlier. And for the end of the lesson, let's do a quick recap. Let's start at the oceans again. Here, the surface layer of the ocean water evaporates, so it goes from a liquid into a gas and travels up into the atmosphere as water vapor. A similar thing happens with transpiration, where the water from the surface of the leaves evaporate into a water vapor and rise up into the atmosphere. Once it's up into the atmosphere, it condenses and the process of condensation happens. That's where the gas turns into a liquid and forms clouds. Now, the heavier the clouds get with the more water they've got, means that they want to release it as precipitation. And that falls as either rain, hail, or snow. And it falls into rivers and lakes. And this is where you've got your surface runoff and your groundwater. And they all collect and flow towards the ocean. And that's where we carry on the cycle again.